Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Blacks Only. That's right, Blacks Only. This is the classically liberal show here on the Big Liberty Show, which makes fun of society's obsession with identity politics and things like race and gender. Well, we're taking the mickey out of that by calling the show Blacks Only, where actually the real diversity we're arguing is intellectual diversity. And as you guys know, on this show, I have a veritable list of guests and regular contributors, the likes of your Dumo Dengas, who's not here, and Noma Gumete, etc., etc. And we're all diverse. Yes, it's a cast, if you will, of Black South Africans, but we're actually diverse where it matters intellectually. And that's the sort of diversity we're trying to suggest or put out, as to being very, very important. Of course, I'm joined in studio by a good friend of mine, Mpiyakhe Dhlamini from the Free Market Foundation. He's, of course, a writer, analyst at the Free Market Foundation, and yeah, he is a classical liberal / anarchist. The homie's views, always argue or changing sometime here and there, but he's consistent though on the issue of liberty and freedom, and that societies that err on the side of freedom, err on the side of liberty, are the most prosperous and give the most opportunity to their citizens. Mpiyakhe, I'm waffling in my opening here. How are you doing, brother?
No, I'm good, man. I'm good. And yourself?
I'm actually very good. I'm very, very chilled. It's been a very good week for me. A lot of Jewish holidays in the beginning, nice. So I'm feeling really refreshed. But yeah. Sorry to cut you short.
I know. If I knew the appropriate Jewish response there, I would have said it just now.
No worries, man. Speaking about responses, though, I think the only thing we're going to talk about here today is essentially classical liberalism in this country and the various conduits in which it's expressing itself, both in politics, civil society, and the like. Because there's been some movement in this regard, especially in the political side of things. I'll have a very frank and terse conversation around specifics, that is the Democratic Alliance, and what I think is happening in that party at the moment. But I want you to talk to me more on the policy side of things. In other words, as I set out what I think are the repercussions or possible repercussions and effects of the shake-up politically, what should the classical liberalism that we often advocate for then look like in a policy sense? So let me open this account then by actually looking at the events of the past essentially week and a half or so. Here's a party which didn't do well electorally, literally suffered heavy losses at the ballot for various reasons, and in fairness to them, decided to go on an introspective journey. So their leader, if he's still going to be the leader, because at the time of recording this, there is scheduled to be a press conference, at 3:00 today in the afternoon, by the leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mr. Mmusi Maimane. We wonder what's going to happen there. Anyway, moving on. But essentially, here's a dude who says, okay, cool, let me review the party, see what is happening, and based on these recommendations, whatever they may be, he'll take action. Long story short, a lot of the recommendations around clarity. Is the leadership in the party, are they communicating clearly to the party, to the electorate? And of course, are they holding the line when it comes to presenting what the DA always argues is the clear blue water between it and other political parties, namely the ANC? We've criticized this before in the past to say that we're not seeing this from, not only them, but generally any political party in this country that self-describes itself as liberal. There is a big thing to be said now around this review process and I think the fallout from it. And my view is generally that the fallout will see the Democratic Alliance losing a lot of the current leadership of the party. We've already seen James self fall out and not resign, retire from his position. And Helen Zille has now ascended to that throne. Their CEO, former CEO Paul Bowie fell on his sword and resigned. And it may be, I'm speculating here, we'll see obviously later today. So you guys will be in the know by the time this is out as to whether their leader, Mmusi Maimane, will take the fall. But there's something to be said. And Mpiyakhe, I won't ask you to comment necessarily on the party politics, but there's something to be said generally about political parties, which just there's almost no difference in them. There's almost a consistent race nationalist identity politics that we've seen generally in South African politics, excuse me, that's my phone. A general identity politics that we've seen and the question I always ask is, if I was in the electorate, would I discern a difference in any of the parties?
I think that's a very spot on question, and I would just like to preface by saying that any views that I give on here are completely my own. They do not belong to my employer, which is the Free Market Foundation. They're just my views, and so I think there's definitely that's the default in South Africa. This racialist sort of politics, like it started. I think it goes even way before the National Party, African nationalism or African nationalism. I think there's just been a constant. South Africa has almost been defined by this the fact that you had white people who living in the country, sort of belonging to a culture. Some of them belong to a culture that was liberal. Some of them belong to a culture which was more collectivist. But because people saw themselves as white and other people saw themselves as black, then there was a politics that arose from just the mere fact of skin color, which seems silly if you just think about it.
Absolutely.
And it didn't just happen in one place, it happened everywhere. It was the black people, the white people, all of them developed this race nationalist politics.
Which we, ironically enough, on this very show, we make fun of in terms of saying it absolutely shocks me that in the 21st century, there are still people who legitimately believe that just because there's two black individuals sitting in the studio right now, that somehow there must be a hive mind. Like we should be sort of channeling each other's thoughts and sentiments and thinking alike.
And you and I are both libertarians ideologically, but within that we have a lot of disagreements.
Absolutely.
I mean, which is one of the great things about liberals. Like liberals, we are painted as one thing in the media, but in fact, like you were just saying in your opening introduction, that's where there's such a lot of diversity. And so breaking the mold was liberalism in South Africa when it was introduced into the country, the ideas, when it entered politics, that was breaking the mold. That was something that was new, that had not been seen before, that was unique, distinct. And so I think it's actually one of the older political movements in the country, if not the oldest, actually. And so this is that would be a difference. If you had an actual liberal party in South Africa championing liberal values, that would be breaking the mold. And I just don't see it anywhere now. Not to tar any of the existing political parties. I'm sure they are doing their best under tough conditions, but I just think from the point of view of an electorate, there seems to be very little difference with the parties that we have on offering right now.
But again, we can marshal some data to suggest maybe that may be the exact trend. So for instance, there's a larger number of people today who just choose to not engage in the politics. And I've always argued that a lot of that it comes down to people not recognizing the values that they hold in their politics. So not only do they not recognize the values, by and large, maybe people don't also recognize the ideas that are reflected in their politics. Because I do a lot of traveling around the country as part of my my role as Big Daddy Liberty, talking to communities around the country about those two things, the ideas that I push out, the classical liberal ideas that I push out, where I always argue they revolve around life, liberty, and property. On life, it's the idea that the individual self-owns themselves. They have a right to life, and the decisions they make about their lives should be theirs. Free from government interference, free from any collectivist ideals. The second, of course, then speaks to the idea of liberty, freedoms, the inherent God-given if you're a person of faith, but the inherent freedoms that every individual should have in order for them to, self-actualize the way they want to and pursue the life that they want to, right? Because those two things speak to each other, the right to life and, of course, the freedoms around it. And, of course, the last one, when I say property, I'm referring, of course, to property rights, which isn't just like the ownership of something, but also just, the idea that you have the right to own, again, I say that it's not just land, sorry, I usually frame this argument by saying it's not just about land, and that property, extends to many other things about the individual. Do you want to speak to those 3 ideas that I push out?
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant way to structure the conversation, because I think we've had a lot of debates what it means to be a liberal in South Africa over the past few days and weeks, and all of them have centered around race. So what you're doing now is actually saying, hey, okay, race is like non-racialism is one of the outcomes of liberalism, but this is where it comes from.
Absolutely.
which is good. And I think in terms of life, like I think there's a lot of common sense among what we would call ordinary people, for lack of a better term. There's a lot of common sense which gels with people's values, and I think that's not a coincidence. That's what liberalism was meant to do. It was meant to resolve conflicts among otherwise peaceful people by providing a structure from within, or a system of ethics that gets translated into what is called the rule of law, for people to resolve their differences within that structure. And so this is why it's basically commonsensical. For example, life. I mean, everyone understands that there's a need to not violate anyone's right to life. You can't just kill someone. You can't just enslave them, like violating their property ownership over their own body, like you were saying before. When it comes to liberty, interference, I mean, this is one of the things that disappoints me in the liberal debate in South Africa, because people will say, Party X is no longer liberal because of race. But when you look at their record on liberty in terms of the interference in people's lives, the regulations, I mean...
That's where you cash them out.
Exactly. I mean, it's insane to me, because you yourself, Sitleno, I know this is meant in the best of good faith, nothing else. In the Western Cape, for example, the liquor regulations, people didn't worry about those things. They only worry when it comes to race. So they don't care about liberty per se, but they care about race only, which is okay, fine. Race is an important aspect. It has tended to define South African liberalism, because it was such of central importance, because liberals were literally fighting against both juggernauts, both African nationalism and African nationalism at the same time, and this is the battle that they've been waging ever since the beginning. And so this is okay. I understand how it has come to dominate South African liberalism, but for me, I think there should be more attention paid on these other issues.
Absolutely.
And I think regulation, for example, okay, race does affect poor people, appointing people to positions of power, not based on merit but based on their rates, definitely affects poor people in terms of the help that they can get. But in terms of poor people helping themselves, the loss of their liberty affects them more than what race does, what race-based policy does. And so I think there should be a more focus put on liberty in terms of just maybe slimming down or cancelling a lot of these regulations that don't seem to make sense, that interfere with people's actions for no reasons. And then when it comes to property, and I think this is the source of everything. I mean, like in all the other areas we've sort of referred to property. When you talk about life, we're talking about ownership of yourself as a person. When you talk about liberty, we're talking about the right to say, to decide what happens to something that you own. This is, and then when it comes to property, this is the core of everything, because you should have the right to own stuff in your own right as an individual. And then, like, if you don't have this ability as an individual to own things, then the state can only grow in power. This is a point I think you have to keep making, because once the individual cannot own anything, then the individual cannot be free. Because where you talk about free speech, where are you going to speak if all the platforms are owned by government? Talk about any right you care about, gun rights, everything. Like, how are you going to exercise gun rights if you can't own a gun, and so on and so on and so on. And so this is the property is the base of everything, and I think there should absolutely be a focus on it. And this is why there should be. I'm glad that there is an unequivocal condemnation of expropriation without compensation, for example, among the parties that were considered liberal. So I think that's. I think that's a nice summary of what liberty is. And I think if you go to, for example, rural KZN, and you say to people like, hey, like you've been farming this land which might or might not be communally owned. You've been farming this land for so long and it's owned by the government. Maybe would you prefer to own it in your own rights and decide what happens to this land? So that maybe you can start planning for in terms of 5 years, 6 years, because you own it. I mean, these are things that are currently not possible for poor people, and this is why liberalism is relevant in South Africa.
And the point you're actually raising is super important. This last point on ownership. often when you listen to the statist socialist communist politician, he'll tell you that no, individuals don't want to own things. And really, we talk about individuals, but really we're a family society. So families don't want to own things. They're quite okay that we, the smart ones, what Marx called the vanguard of the proletariat, the vanguard of the poor, we must own things on their behalf. We must decide who gets what, how. And obviously then politics becomes the conduit or the deciding factor around who gets what, and not necessarily merit or ability or whatever the case may be. Anyway, but the point I was trying to drive at is you raise it in the context of KZN, and obviously both of us are from KZN, so it registers on a personal level. If you speak to the average guy and you ask him or her, who should own the land? Should it be you? And when I say you, the family. In other words, and I frame it in real ways. So I say, should you be able to fence it and say it's owned by the Dlaminis or the Ngobeses? Should you be able to fence it off and decide what happens there? Or should it be owned by the local king, Induna, slash the king, and by proxy, really, the government? Because ultimately, that's who the king, right now, in terms of how things are organized, is essentially a representative of the government, indirectly and directly. And 9 times out of 10 in Mpiyakhe, no matter how traditionalist even the person may be, they'll actually say, you know what, it should be owned by family. Again, don't take it from me, don't take it from Mpiyakhe. I'm going to put maybe here a link to a video I did when I was at the ANC manifesto, and I spoke to ANC members on this very issue, on the issue of what they expected to hear from their president. And one of the guys who spoke to me, unscripted, unprepared, if you will, says, hey, I'm from rural KZN, and the one thing I want to hear from the president is him have a conversation about finally giving us ownership of the land, so that, as he put it, if an investor comes, he speaks to me directly. He doesn't go through the local Induna. These are the values, or rather, these are the ideas that when I talk about life, liberty, and property, I want to hear political parties talk more about empowering the individual, empowering the family, because we have not been having this conversation in this country. And you rightly pointed out that we're distracted by things like race, we're distracted by things like, essentially identity politics, and no one gets to the nub of how do you actually build a prosperous and a free society? What are the tools that you need to do this? Because we're not focusing on the ideas, we're not focusing on the values, we focus on distractions. Now, maybe as I look to tie up the conversation in the last sort of 3 minutes we have, 4 minutes we have, I began this conversation by talking about the Democratic Alliance. And I'm going to move the conversation away from just focusing on them necessarily, but arguing that now that they're having this restructuring and maybe things are changing, I would argue that we want to see a more classically liberal party, one that is non-racial, one that focuses policy on extending liberties and freedoms as much as possible to individuals. What does that party look like? And we don't necessarily have to talk about the DA, but you mentioned the need for a liberal, classical liberal party. What does that party look like? And I'm going to give us 3 categories to chew on in terms of them broadly being called enabling opportunities: healthcare, education, safety and security. What does the policy framework of a liberal party look like? And if the DA is listening, pay attention.
Yes. So I would say that you're absolutely right. Like on healthcare, for example, I think in South Africa, it does have to be recognized that as much as any welfare spending, which will increase the size of the government or will make government bigger than it should be, but we need to recognize that a lot of people are dependent on the government through no fault of their own, because the government is cynically set out to make them dependent.
Absolutely.
And so you have to win them off sort of softly. And I would say like the RR's proposal for a voucher, for voucherizing healthcare, and many other people as well. The FMF, I think, also supports a version of voucherization. And so I think that's absolutely the right policy towards decreasing the size of the state. Education, I think a similar policy would hold, like just ensure you have school choice. And I mean, another interesting model to look at might be the charter school model in the USA, for example. That's another policy. I think a lot of these things are our only metric would be whether this thing tends to increase liberty or not. If it increases liberty, then it's good, but then it might be specific to a particular area. In one area, which is another thing that liberals have to pay attention to. That policy has to be appropriate to a particular area. It's not going to be across the whole country.
As federal as possible,
exactly.
as local and as devolved as possible.
Exactly.
Power and authority must be.
So some regions or some provinces will have vouchers, some provinces will have charter schools, some provinces will have dominant public schools. For example, public schools in Gauteng and Western Cape are relatively well run relative to the rest of the country. So some parents might say, hey, since I'm in Gauteng, I would rather choose the public school. So it's going to differ across the country. And then finally, when it comes to, sorry, I forgot your last.
So safety and security will be the last.
Okay, I know. Which is one of the most important.
Absolutely.
Because in survey after survey, South Africans mention this as probably one of the most important things. And there I would say, look at the work my friend Zach Mpele, who's the MP, has done in terms of.
Very quickly. We spoke to on the show on the Liberty and Friends. I'll put the link somewhere on here. You can also listen to that. Sorry, a lot of advertising going on here today.
Yeah, he knows.
Talk to me.
He knows the subject much better than I do.
Strong command of it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he would be the best person to speak there. But some of the things he suggested, like decentralizing the command of SEP stations and letting communities appoint their station commanders, are all very good suggestions, because at the end of the day, crime strategies have to be locally based, as we were saying. Like you can't just have, you cannot simply have a one size fits all. It doesn't work. Absolutely. And also just have meritocracy in the police service. Don't just appoint people because of race. And this is how the racialist thinking fits into everything, because you end up appointing people because of race, and then meritocracy suffers, and then high crime rates. And so this is why you need to appoint people just based on the basis of meritocracy, and we need to get to that somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree. And maybe as we wrap up, I'll give us another 2 minutes just to wrap up. There is something to be said, therefore. And I agree, by the way, with all your suggestions. As you said, a lot of them also are the house view, if you will, of the Institute of Race Relations, especially on, the education vouchers, the idea that why should government spend, or rather, why should government be the one that controls the spending of an annualized healthcare budget? Why don't they break it up and put it into vouchers, if you will, and give those vouchers to parents for them to decide how they dispense of those funds on behalf of their children? You'd have much better decision making, both in the demand and the supply side. So the demand is created because the parents have cash in hand. The supply, of course, government then takes a step back and says we'd like the private sector to come in. It can even sell government schools for R1. That's one of our proposals, as little as R1 to the management of a private or NGO or religious institution, whatever it may be, for the management of it, to then attract these vouchers and get quality education going.
And I agree, absolutely. I just wanted to say one more thing on this. Any welfare program or any program to assist the poor, in order for it to be moral, it must be a program at winning people off, depending on the state.
Spot on.
Yeah.
Spot on.
If it's just a program to help poor people indefinitely, then that program cannot be accepted by classical liberals.
Absolutely. You're 100% spot on. And essentially, things like education vouchers, health vouchers are designed to do exactly that. Yeah. You move a family who at a particular generation are completely dependent on the state to eventually, once of course they have the freedom, you give them the freedom to pursue their opportunities, to pursue their interests, they can then actually say, you know what, we don't need the state's assistance. Our kids are now, university educated, we are employed, or whatever the case may be. And as you rightly point out, they weaned off the state. And that's the kind of society you want. When we talk about a free and prosperous society, that is exactly what we're referring to. Mpiyakhe, let me wrap it up here. And let me just say to you, the viewer, thank you for watching. Mpiyakhe, of course, is a regular contributor to the show. About the show, Blacks Only, lots of interesting stuff coming in the next year. So gird your loins. You're going to see the show blow up in a very interesting way, going forward. And with that being said, Mpiyakhe, thank you for joining me. And you can expect the show to now come at you once every week. I have not decided what release date or day it'll be. So I'll stick to Sunday for now, but once a week is the frequency in which it'll go out on. And remember, if you want to support the work that I do here on the Big Liberty Show, and of course in association with the Institute of Race Relations, and hey, why not become a part donor of the IRR by joining our crowdfunding campaign? And that campaign you can join by signing up, or rather SMSing your name to 32823. Terms and conditions apply. That SMS will cost you R1. Or hey, if you're part of the tech-savvy ones, you can find us online at irr.org.za. Remember to follow Mpiyakhe Dhlamini on Twitter. His name handle is @Turing_1991.
Perfect.
I'll put that on the screen. And of course, you can follow your favorite fat boy on any of my social media. Just search Big Daddy Liberty or The Big Liberty Show. Guys, you watching Blacks Only. Remember, never trust a commie.